This team of agents is on the hunt.
Marco! Marco! Marco!
The crew thought they were stopping another smuggling run, but the moment they pulled alongside the drifting narco-sub, something felt wrong. The vessel barely moved. No voices answered. No hatch opened. What waited inside was nothing anyone in the Coast Guard had ever trained for.
You've seen the heart-stopping video of the Coast Guard seizing a speeding drug sub. But what's it like inside one of these vessels?
It was darker than a drug haul, more disturbing than a chase, and so human that it shook hardened officers to their core.
Oh my God.
Could cost you your life.
This thing is monstrous.
This submarine was not built to transport cargo. It was built for something far worse.
The homemade submarine
worth more than $165 million.
The ghost shape in the waves. The first sighting came during a routine Coast Guard patrol on a quiet stretch of open water. The ocean looked calm and ordinary until a faint shape appeared ahead of the patrol craft. At first, it looked like a large piece of debris. The outline did not rise above the waves the way a normal vessel would. It stayed low and flat, almost as if it were trying to hide. The crew slowed the engine and watched it drift. It moved in short, uneven motions that did not match the smooth glide of a typical submarine. Each small movement looked forced, as if something inside was shifting its weight to adjust the balance. The patrol approached carefully. The ocean around the object behaved strangely. The waves near the hull flattened instead of building up. It looked as if something very heavy inside the submarine was pressing downward and forcing the water to settle. The crew members exchanged uneasy looks. They had seen narco-subs before, but none of those vessels behaved like this. One of the operators leaned forward with binoculars. He thought he saw blurred marks on the hull. They looked like handprints pressed against the inside of the metal. The marks vanished when a wave splashed across the surface. He said nothing at first. He did not want to be the only person who saw something he could not explain. As they drew closer, the feeling of dread deepened. The submarine did not show any signs of active control. No lights, no movement from the top hatch, no response to radio calls. The silence around it felt heavy and unnatural. The crew kept their distance for a moment, unsure if they were approaching a smuggler's vessel or something far more dangerous. They prepared for every possibility. They considered the risk of explosives. They considered the chance of armed suspects hiding inside. None of those explanations fit the way the vessel moved. When they finally brought the patrol craft alongside it, a faint metallic sound came from inside the hull. It was low and slow, like a deep groan forced through thick metal. The crew froze. The sound repeated a moment later. It was not the sound of an engine or a machine. It sounded like the submarine itself was exhaling. The metal seemed to shift slightly, almost as if the structure was under pressure from something inside. The crew could not tell if the pressure came from the ocean or from whatever waited behind the sealed hatch. The operator, who had seen the marks on the hull, whispered what he thought he saw earlier. The rest of the crew stared at the submarine in complete silence. The stillness around it grew more intense. Something about the vessel felt wrong in a way no one wanted to describe. It looked empty, yet every part of it hinted that no one on board had left willingly. They prepared to board, still unsure whether they were heading into a rescue or a disaster. That uncertainty lasted only a few seconds. Something inside the submarine made a new sound. It was faint and strained. It sounded almost human. The real nightmare began when the boarding team stepped onto the hull and realized the vessel was not responding at all. Something inside was calling for help in the weakest way possible. The hatch that wouldn't open, and the tapping no one expected. The boarding team stepped onto the slick surface of the submarine with extreme caution. They knew the vessel was unstable. It sat so low in the water that one wrong movement could send it rolling. The first priority was to reach the hatch. The second was to open it before anything inside collapsed or sank. The team expected the hatch to react the same way it did during most narcotic seizures at sea. Smugglers understand that a narco-sub is extremely unstable during a confrontation. If water leaks in, or if the vessel tips even slightly, it can sink in minutes with everyone trapped inside. So, the moment the Coast Guard knocks and identifies itself, the hatch usually bursts open from the inside. The crew on board open it themselves because they want to escape the enclosed chamber before anything goes wrong. This time none of that happened. The metal hatch stayed firmly in place. It did not move even a fraction of an inch. It did not produce the usual rattling sound that comes from someone trying to open it from the inside. It did not respond to the clear and repeated calls from the officers. The lack of movement made the team realize that no one inside was making any effort to come to the surface. This was unusual and deeply concerning because any crew trapped inside a low-riding vessel would normally rush to open it for fear of drowning or suffocating. The lead boarding officer called out again. He used simple instructions and asked anyone inside to respond. The only reply was the sound of waves hitting the side of the hull. The team grew uneasy. A sealed hatch often meant one of two things. It could mean the crew had already abandoned the vessel. It could also mean something inside had gone very wrong. The officer banged firmly on the hatch to test for movement. The sound echoed back at them in a strange way. It felt thick and muffled, as if the air inside the submarine was heavy and unmoving. A few seconds later, a new sound broke through the silence. It came from directly beneath the hatch. It was a faint tapping. The sound was so weak that the team had to lean closer to be sure they heard it correctly. The tapping did not follow any pattern. It did not sound like someone signaling with intent. It sounded like someone using the last of their strength to make any noise they could. The officers froze. It was the first clear sign that someone inside was still alive. The team immediately attempted to open the hatch. They pulled the handle and tried to force it upward, but it refused to move. It felt jammed. The resistance felt stronger than a simple mechanical issue. It felt like the hatch had been sealed tightly from the outside. The tapping grew softer as they struggled. The officer closest to the hatch placed his ear to the metal. He heard a strained hit against the inside surface. Then another, each one lighter than the last. The sound carried a sense of urgency that told the team they had only minutes left to get inside. The team used a metal tool to pry the hatch open. The process took longer than anyone expected because the seal had been tightened in a way that suggested intentional reinforcement. The tapping faded into slow thuds, then it stopped completely. The sudden silence unsettled the entire team. They knew they had lost contact with whoever was trying to signal them. When the hatch finally cracked open, a rush of thick air burst upward. The air was hot and suffocating. It carried the strong smell of diesel fuel and the unmistakable odor of decay. The smell hit the team immediately. One of the officers stepped back and covered his nose. The others pushed forward because they understood what the smell meant. The air inside the submarine had not circulated for a long time. Anyone inside had been breathing toxic fumes with no escape. The moment the opening widened enough, the team shined their flashlights into the chamber. What they saw inside did not match any normal interdiction. There was no active crew, no signs of sabotage equipment. There was only stillness. The interior looked like a space that had become lethal long before the Coast Guard arrived. The officers did not know exactly what happened yet, but they could already tell they were standing at the entrance of a tragedy rather than a routine seizure. They prepared to enter very slowly. They had to protect themselves from the same conditions that killed the people inside. The air continued to leak out in heavy bursts, each one carrying more of the toxic fumes that had built up over time. The team secured their masks and prepared their equipment. The team climbed down into the opening with the understanding that what they would find inside would likely change the direction of the entire mission. The submarine of the poisoned and the dead. The moment the boarding team lowered themselves through the narrow opening, the reality inside the submarine became impossible to ignore. The chamber felt like an oven. The air was thick and heavy. Every breath burned the throat. Condensation dripped from the fiberglass walls in slow streams. The droplets mixed with diesel residue and created a sour smell that clung to the skin. The flashlight beams cut through the haze and revealed bodies slumped in unnatural positions. Some men had collapsed over fuel bladders that lined the floor. Others leaned against stacks of cargo that had been packed so tightly that their bodies looked wedged between the bales. Their skin showed signs of prolonged exposure to extreme fumes. The surfaces of their arms and faces appeared mottled. Patches of discoloration spread across their shoulders and necks. The heat inside the compartment had overwhelmed them long before the Coast Guard arrived. The officers moved in further and checked each man for signs of life. Most showed none. A few had shallow movements in their chests, barely enough to count as breathing. Their bodies twitched slightly as they struggled to hold on. One of the surviving crew members suddenly gasped in a sharp, panicked breath. His eyes opened, but they did not focus on anything in front of him. He looked confused, scared, and already halfway gone. His hand lifted with unsteady movement and closed around the nearest officer's wrist. The grip was weak, but the desperation in it was clear. He was trying to hold on to the only living person he could reach. His lips trembled as he tried to speak. The officer leaned closer, unsure if the man could form any words at all. The survivor forced out a whisper that shook the entire team. He said, "They sealed us in. Please, tell my family." His voice cracked at the last word. It sounded like someone trying to push out years of fear in one final sentence. The officer held his arm gently, trying to keep him awake, but the man's strength faded in seconds. His fingers slipped from the officer's wrist. His hand fell against the floor without resistance. His chest rose one last time and then stopped. The officer stayed frozen for a few seconds. He felt the man's last breath leave his body. He did not know the man's name. He did not know where his family lived. He only knew that this man died begging for someone to tell his family what happened. The officer lowered his head, trying to steady himself while the rest of the team watched in stunned silence. The only sound in the entire chamber came from the slow dripping of moisture falling from the ceiling onto the dead man's arm. The loss hit the team hard. They understood immediately that they were no longer dealing with a standard interdiction. They were inside a place where people had died begging for help that never came. The team realized they needed to work quickly. The fumes filled the space so completely that several of the Coast Guardsmen began coughing almost immediately. Their lungs reacted to the low oxygen and the strong diesel vapors. Each breath became harder to take. The heat made every movement more difficult. Sweat ran down their faces and soaked into their protective gear. The officers understood that the crew had been trapped inside with no air circulation. The chamber was so tightly sealed that the oxygen had been consumed by the diesel engine and the men themselves. The remaining air had turned toxic as the fuel fumes spread. The officers exchanged urgent looks. They needed to extract the survivors as fast as possible. The team prepared to move back toward the hatch, but something near the bow pulled their attention. A long, dark stain trailed upward along the inner wall. It looked as if something or someone had dragged against the fiberglass. The stain ran straight toward the sealed hatch at the front of the chamber. What they found near the front of the vessel would reveal the full extent of the terror these men faced. Claw marks in the dark. The officers moved toward the bow, following the dark stain that stretched along the inner wall. The stain grew thicker the closer they came to the sealed front compartment. When they raised their flashlights, the beams revealed dried blood smeared across the fiberglass interior. The patterns were uneven. Some streaks ran upward, others spread sideways. It looked like someone had pressed their hands against the wall and dragged them in every direction while trying to stay conscious. A few more steps revealed the source of the marks. Deep gouges were carved into the hull. They were long and jagged, running in frantic lines across the surface. The officers leaned in and saw that the grooves had been torn into the wall by human hands. Pieces of fingernails lay scattered across the floor. Several of them remained embedded in the fiberglass, where the man had clawed with so much force that the nails snapped off and stayed lodged in the material. Here is the revised section with the missing explanation added smoothly and clearly, tying subtopic 1 and subtopic 4 together without changing your tone or rules. Everything remains very clear, fully explained, and non-poetic. They found the crewman responsible a moment later. He had collapsed near the base of the hatch. His fingers were torn and shredded. His hands were curled inward from the strain. His body was twisted in a way that showed how violently he had fought to stay upright. He took his last breath with one arm stretched toward the hatch handle. His fingertips rested only a few inches below it. It was clear he died reaching for a way out that never opened. The officers slowly connected what they were seeing with what one of their own had witnessed earlier on the outside of the vessel. The blurred marks that seemed like handprints on the outer hull now made sense. The man had clawed the walls so violently that the pressure of his movements pushed against the fiberglass from inside. The interior wall flexed slightly as he struck it again and again. When the submarine rolled in the water, those impacts created faint impressions on the outside surface. The operator had noticed the shapes during the approach without understanding how they formed. Now the officers realized that the man had been hitting and scraping the same area repeatedly while trying to reach the hatch. The slight movement of the vessel allowed the fiberglass to bend just enough for the marks to appear briefly on the outside before the waves washed them away. The officers stood in silence as the vessel shifted gently with the movement of the waves. The slight roll caused the man's body to tilt and settle again. The movement created a sickening feeling in the team. They understood that he had clawed the walls in complete darkness while breathing toxic fumes. He had fought until he no longer had the strength to lift his own arm. The officers forced themselves to keep searching the compartment. Every instinct told them to leave, but they needed to understand what happened. They needed answers for the families who would one day learn how these men died. The question hanging over all of them was simple. Why were these men locked inside a sealed chamber with no way out? The answer began to take shape when one officer noticed a waterproof bag hidden beneath a corpse. Inside it was evidence that pointed directly to the cartel's intentions. The orders that sent these men to die. One of the officers knelt beside the dead man near the bow. The man's arm was stretched across his chest in a stiff and unnatural position. Something was wedged beneath it. The officer lifted the forearm gently and found a small waterproof phone pressed against the man's ribs. The device was scratched and stained, but the protective casing had held. The officer handed it to the team leader, who opened the cover and pressed the power button. The screen lit up. Several audio files appeared. None of them were labeled with dates or names. They were identified only by simple numbers. The team leader tapped the first recording. A man's voice filled the submarine with a force that made several officers flinch. The speaker sounded furious, but his anger was tightly controlled. He spoke in a level voice that carried a sharper threat than yelling ever could. He accused the crew of losing product on a previous voyage. He said the loss had cost him money, time, and trust. He reminded them that the shipment they failed to deliver had been worth more than everything they owned in their entire lives. The crew tried to answer, but the moment one of them spoke, the man's voice exploded. He yelled for them to shut up. He said they were not allowed to speak until he finished. The sudden shift from calm to explosive rage stunned the Coast Guard officers who were listening. The commander continued with heavy breathing in the background. He described the missing load in detail. It was large enough to supply multiple buyers waiting in different countries. He yelled that the failure had damaged his own standing with people he answered to. He reminded the men that the people waiting for that product already knew their names. He said the buyers had lost patience and would expect consequences. The next recording explained the punishment. The voice said they would complete one final run, and that they would do it sealed inside the submarine from the moment the loading began until the vessel reached its destination. The commander spoke slowly and clearly so none of the men could misunderstand him. He said the hatch would remain locked, and no one would open it under any circumstance. He mentioned several of their family members by name. He warned them that if they refused to board or attempted to escape, the consequences would fall on the people they loved. The threat forced the men to carry out the mission, even though they understood the danger. Another recording captured the loading process. The sound of footsteps and heavy equipment echoed in the background. Several of the trapped crew begged for air. Their voices sounded panicked. They asked the men outside to leave the hatch unsealed for a few minutes so the fumes would not build up so quickly. They explained that the diesel smell inside was already strong and that they needed time to adjust. The pleas were ignored. The commander ordered the workers to keep sealing the hatch. He said they did not need comfort. They only needed to complete the run. The recording picked up the sound of someone striking the inside of the hatch in frustration. The metal vibrated and the voices became more frantic. The final audio file was the shortest. It began with coughing. The coughing grew heavier, and several men gasped for air. Someone tried to speak but could not finish his sentence. Then came a sharp thud as the hatch locked from the outside. The muffled sound of men shouting grew faint as the oxygen inside the chamber continued to drop. The recording ended without warning. The officers stared at the phone in disbelief. They played the last recording a second time, not because they needed clarification, but because they could not believe that the men had been sealed inside a vessel that was already filling with toxic fumes. The recordings made one fact clear. This submarine was never designed to be navigated safely. The coffin submarine. The officers began a closer inspection of the submarine's interior. The more they examined the structure, the clearer it became that the vessel had never been designed to complete any delivery. One officer checked the ventilation ducts along the side walls. He expected to see basic airflow channels, even if they were crude. Instead, he found the ducts covered with solid panels that had been glued shut. There was no way for fresh air to enter, or for toxic fumes to escape. Another officer moved toward the lower part of the compartment and examined the scuttle valve. The valve controls water intake, and crews normally use it to adjust buoyancy. This one had been welded permanently open. Water had been entering the hull slowly and predictably, just enough to increase humidity and heat without sinking the vessel too fast. The design made it impossible for the men inside to stop the flooding or stabilize the craft. The fuel bladders took up most of the floor space. They were strapped in a way that made no practical sense for navigation. Their positions ensured that fumes would rise directly into the cramped crew chamber before reaching the engine. The smell alone was enough to make the officers cough. The fumes would have overwhelmed the crew long before the vessel traveled any reasonable distance. A standard narco-sub is rough and unstable, but it is still built to move cargo from one point to another. This submarine was different. Every feature indicated a deliberate attempt to trap and kill the people inside. Whoever funded the voyage wanted the crew dead long before any confrontation with authorities. One officer powered on the GPS system. The route displayed showed a looping path that circled offshore without heading toward any destination. The submarine had been drifting with no plan to reach land. As they prepared to leave the vessel, one officer noticed a sealed compartment that had not been opened yet. What they found inside would reveal the full scale of the cartel's brutality. The discovery that terrified the Coast Guard. One of the officers moved along the stern and tapped the wall with the back of his hand. The sound felt different from the rest of the fiberglass. It was hollow and carried a faint vibration that suggested another space behind it. He called the others over and began removing the thin panel. The panel peeled away with little resistance, revealing a hidden compartment that none of them expected to see. The beam of the flashlight entered the space, and what it revealed forced the entire team to stop moving. Inside the compartment were several personal items. There were wallets with worn photographs inside them. There were folded identification cards that belonged to men who had been reported missing long before this vessel crossed open water. There were notebooks that looked damaged from moisture, but still readable. Each item belonged to someone who never made it home. The officers knew immediately that these men had not vanished willingly. Their belongings had been stored in this compartment for a reason that was now becoming painfully clear. When the officers pointed their lights farther into the space, they saw bones scattered under sheets of plastic. Some were fully exposed. Others were wrapped loosely in damaged coverings. The bones were mixed with scraps of clothing, ropes, and fragments of tape. The officers stared for several seconds before anyone spoke. These remains had been placed here deliberately. They were not the result of an accident. They were the result of repeated use of the submarine as a place to dispose of people. It became clear that this submarine had not been used for transportation alone. The cartel had been using it as a drifting graveyard. Anyone who became a problem for them could be sealed inside and pushed into the ocean. Witnesses, forced couriers, men who took on debts they could not repay, and even people who never meant to be involved were all possible victims. The officers felt their stomachs tighten. They knew that at least some of the men who died inside this vessel had never chosen this life. Some had been forced to work for the cartel to protect their families. Some had been forced to work off debts they could never repay. Others had been threatened into service after the cartel identified their families. A few may have chosen the work themselves, but never agreed to die inside a sealed chamber. The discovery sent shock through the entire team. They looked at each other and understood the seriousness of what they had found. This was no longer only about drugs. This was about lives taken in the darkest way possible. The officers climbed out of the submarine carrying the weight of every man who had died inside it. Some wiped their faces. Others stayed quiet. All of them felt the same realization settling in. The cartel was growing more cruel and more willing to take lives without hesitation. The officers made a silent promise to each other as they stood on the hull. They promised to fight harder and to stop vessels like this before more people were lost. What they had witnessed would stay with them. It broke their hearts, but it also became the clearest reason to continue the mission with everything they had. Kindly subscribe to the channel for more eye-opening videos like this.